Order, order. Welcome to this first evidence session on crime and statistics. I'd like to welcome each of our witnesses and invite each of you to identify yourselves for the record, please.
James Patrick, police officer.
Paul Ford from the Police Federation of England and Wales.
Roger Patrick, retired police officer.
Peter Barron, retired police officer.
I just have sort of one or two parish notices. First of all, I think I should declare the fact that James Patrick is a serving police constable with the Metropolitan Police, but who lives in my constituency. And this evidence session arises out of the accident that Mr. Patrick is my constituent. And he came to see me about his disciplinary case and the situation he's found himself in. I make no comment about that in this forum, and nor should his disciplinary hearing be referred to in this evidence session, as we're going to treat that as what we call sub judice. That is not for discussion, but I just feel I ought to say that Mr. Patrick is my constituent, which is how he came to be here. And secondly, I think it's only fair to say that Dr. Roger Patrick and Constable James Patrick are not related, and there is no connection between them, even by marriage. Third, I want to put on record how grateful I am for the written evidence we have received, and how personally I am truly shocked by what I have read. Shocked for two reasons. Shocked that apparently such manipulation of police statistics could possibly happen on such a wide scale and become so institutionally prevalent. And shocked that we have known about it for such a long time and so little has changed as a result of that public knowledge of this problem. Finally, I just wish to say another point about privilege. Whatever you say in this session is privileged. That is, so long as you believe it to be true and sincerely believe it to be true, you can say whatever you like without fear nor favour, because no court or disciplinary hearing or other tribunal can use in evidence against you anything you say in this committee. But that is obviously a privilege not to be abused. But that means we also cannot refer to, as I said, the disciplinary hearing in question, or indeed to the case of 5 officers in a certain constabulary who are subject to proceedings regarding their alleged manipulation of data. You may be aware of the case in question. I have one other formality, which is to welcome Sheila Gilmore to this committee, newly elected. Very much enjoying you being here and having joined the committee. Thank you very much for your interest. I have to ask whether you have any interests to declare.
Only the ones that are on my register of interests.
That's fine. So there are no other particular interests relevant to this committee that you feel you're required to declare?
No.
Thank you. We will now proceed. May I ask each of you to give a view on, well, perhaps I could start with Dr. Patrick. Can you just describe what techniques, which you've described in your written evidence, tend to be used by police officers to alter the outcome of the statistical measures that we use for recording crime?
Certainly, sir. There's a number of techniques that come under what police officers would call the generic term of cuffing. That's making crime figures disappear up the sleeve in reference to the magician's art. They Actual methods would be someone reports a crime to disbelieve them and not record it at all, say they're making it up or it's a false report. Secondly, they may well record it as lost property. Another technique would be to record a sequence of crimes in the same street, say 5 or 6 cars that have been broken into, different owners, record that as just one crime, sort of continuous offence rule. You could also massage the figures by de-recording crimes, decategorising them, so a senior officer would look at a crime report and decide that no crime had occurred and inappropriately take it off the books. Then you've got other methods whereby you downgrade burglaries to theft from property, attempt burglaries as criminal damage.
And that's all under the term cuffing?
Yes.
And what
Yes,
about
sir.
nodding?
Nodding is another matter altogether. That's about collusion between offenders and police officers to improve the detection rate, where a deal is reached with the offender for them to omit a number of offences, thus making the performance of the force look good in terms of detections, in return for inducements either through charging less serious offences and TIC in more serious ones so that the sentence is reduced, or an agreement to produce the offender from prison after they've been sentenced and take them in a nodding exercise where they drive round and nod at properties that they are supposedly have broken into. And that improves the detection rate. And sometimes inducements in the forms of sex, alcohol, access to meals, etc. is offered on those occasions when they're brought out of prison. That's nodding.
And what is skewing?
Skewing is putting your resources into the areas that you've been measured in. So if your performance measures are to reduce burglary, you put your resources into investigating burglaries at the cost of investigating something like rape or child protection, and you move your resources accordingly. Sometimes you will see forces systematically move resources out of inner city areas to more affluent areas where crime is easier to detect. Generally that's not done deliberately, but the way that the formulas are used can result in that occurring. It's quite a complex issue, that movement of resources.
And finally, stitching?
That's the old phrase for fitting somebody up, putting evidence into their mouths, either through verbaling, attributing false confessions to them. Those tended to be practices that were prevalent in the past, less so now. It tends to be abuse of non-judicial disposals, which lends itself to sort of stitching, where somebody's offered a caution when really there isn't evidence that would result in a conviction, or informal warnings. Sometimes the suspect isn't even aware that they've occurred. So they're recorded as responsible for a crime without them actually being confronted about it.
Now, Constable Patrick, could you first of all describe to us what your various roles have been in the Metropolitan Police to do with the recording and measurement of crime?
Absolutely. I transferred to the Metropolitan Police in October 2009. On my transfer I had a background in intelligence analysis, which I'd been doing at my previous
I think you have to
force.
speak up a little bit.
Sorry, I'd been doing intelligence analysis at my previous force. So I had a good concept of the measurement of crime, how to analyse it correctly, the different types and brackets of crime, and some of the tricks which Roger has described. I came initially to a response team. My experience on that response team essentially was to do with robberies, first of all, in that robbery offences, and I do mean clear robbery offences, would be downgraded. In the Met, they use to do so an offence called theft snatch, which doesn't actually exist. It isn't recognised by the Home Office. It's a convenient way of effectively getting a robbery off the books, but not putting it into the theft from person bracket. It was a non-existent type of crime, and this would happen even in clear cases where there was CCTV showing a robbery taking place. The extent of this on the borough that I was initially on was large. They were showing on some reports, which were very swiftly removed, a 400% increase in street robberies. If you were to look at the same reports a couple of days later, robberies would be static, but theft snatch would have increased by a large amount. I challenged this on my borough. I eventually contacted the Assistant Commissioner proposing an alternative way of doing this, and was given a specialist role at Territorial Policing Headquarters, where I went on to look at some new types of measures that would help us step away from this categoric measurement or targeting of these types of crime like robbery. From there, I was involved in a project which was working with the Home Office to review the way that burglary is investigated in the Met. Again, burglary is an area where crimes are downgraded or moved into other brackets, such as criminal damage for attempted burglary or other types of thefts. I found, doing the pre-analysis on one borough for this, that there was a disparity of several percent, and that depended on which of the two force systems you used to retrieve the data from.
So you were looking at two systems of data, recording data, and they were basically recording the same data. But
Absolutely. They were recording the same data, but both systems would show a variation in the level of the same offences. So it was completely inexplicable. I discussed this with some of the analysts at the Met, and they highlighted to me that they'd been aware of this problem for some time, and they'd actually performed some audit reports and found that as many as 300 burglaries would disappear within a couple of week period. So things would clearly be being reported as burglaries. You then rerun the same report. There'd been a human intervention, i.e. a management intervention, and those burglaries had effectively disappeared in a puff of smoke. I then was put into another specialist role, this time with serious crime and operations, and working on the crime fighters team, which effectively once a month gathers together the headline performance data for specialist crime and operations at a very senior level. So you're talking an assistant commissioner, chief superintendents and commanders sat in the room to discuss what's happened in that month. As part and parcel of that, in July, I did some analysis around serious sexual offences and rape. In the course of doing that, I found that no crimes, which is a way effectively of establishing that a report is no longer a crime to be investigated, were incorrect in about 80% of cases.
80%?
Yes. That's my professional opinion based on what I looked at. It was 80% of cases. I went on to look at crime-related incidents, which is another very Met-centric type of thing. It's where effectively you say, yeah, crime has occurred, but it's a third-party report. That would be the general rule for when you would use a crime-related incident instead of a crime. So the victim hasn't confirmed it to you face-to-face. It's a referral from another agency. In reviewing those, I found that in 70% of cases, they shouldn't have been crime-related incidents. They were clear crimes. So I went on to do some analysis of 12 months' worth of data and established a statistical norm for the use of no crime and CRI, and then reversing the trend...
CRI, you'll just have to clarify.
Sorry, crime-related incidents.
Right.
Reversing that trend, what you could clearly see, if you were to backwards apply the 70% inaccuracy in no crime and the inaccuracy in the crime-related incident rate, the Met had effectively been under-recording rape and serious sexual offences by between 22 and 25%.
Now, there was a controversy about the handling of sexual offences in the Metropolitan Police quite a short time ago.
There was.
And one would hope that that incident would have led to the resolution of concerns like this. Do you feel they've been resolved?
No. If I may just briefly refer to my statement, I can give you the view of the Metropolitan Police as of July this year, which is after that was concluded.
Just remind us of the name of that investigation.
It was the IPCC investigation into the Southwark Sapphire unit. in which they concluded that victims had been mistreated, crimes had been inappropriately closed as no crime, and I believe there was a police officer dealt with at court for that. In following my analysis of the data, I spoke to the Specialist Crime and Operations Crime Management Unit. Now, a Crime Management Unit is effectively a special oversight unit which, when crime reports are logged, it's their job to review the individual reports to make sure that they've been done ethically, done properly, aren't misrecorded as no crimes, aren't misrecorded as crime-related incidents. The summary of that conversation was that across all OCUs, which is operational command units, officers were chancing it, asking for no crimes, but that this was most prevalent in respect of sexual offences. CMU, which is the Crime Management Unit, were doing their best, but with too limited a resource to ensure that it was kept only to a minimum. So effectively they haven't got enough staff to keep a lid on it. They went on to say that normally a crime-related incident is recorded because the initial report is third party, so that's actually within the rules, but after 4 weeks or so, which could be 20 to 50 pages of investigative details, they were actually finding that they were looking at crimes instead of CRIs, and they should have been reclassified at a much earlier stage. And the important thing to note is that the local supervisory regime would be that a detective sergeant, detective inspector would do periodic reviews on these reports in any case. So these shouldn't be going on for weeks and weeks and weeks. This should be identified much, much sooner.
Otherwise, it's not justified to downgrade the crime.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's also known that officers are keeping crime-related incident cases until they achieve a disposal, which they describe as being effectively to keep them off the figures until it's a positive result.
So that means they basically, until they've got a detection,
Yeah.
they're not going to record it as a crime, and they only record it as a crime if they get a detection.
Yeah.
So it goes straight into the tick box, well done box, instead of a problem unsolved box.
These are the words from the horse's mouth. These are something which I recorded in a conversation with the crime management unit themselves. These are not my words. They went on to say that in part the problem is ignorance of the counting rules, and also in the Metropolitan Police, and this is a side note which came up later, that tendentially they are working to the charging standards, which is well beyond the remit of actually what we're there to do. We don't do deciding guilt. That's court. That's the justice system. We gather evidence and put it before the justice system. So effectively we're usurping that in some way by preempting it with our own decisions based on those standards, which is inappropriate. Within SCD5, which is now renamed as SOECA, it is the unit which deals with child sexual offences predominantly. The bulk of the issue relating to no crime, they say, was officers not understanding the counting rules, but it appears to be the perception that serious sexual offences being undetected is a dirty word, so the preference has developed to try and justify no crime on the basis of mental health or similar issues of vulnerability, or by saying that the victim has refused to go on to disclose to them. Now,
so this would finish up with trying to persuade a victim that they weren't raped, for example.
effectively, yeah.
And Dr. Patrick, you're nodding at this.
Yes, but not in the nodding sense we've spoken earlier. This is my experience as well, that this is, you can see that in the investigations that have been carried out, that victims are being pressurised.
Further to that, there is actually published external research now which was done by the London universities. I think if you were to use Google to look up UCL and King's College sexual offence victims, you would find the recently released study, which I actually do refer to later, is now published, and it does conclude that where a victim is vulnerable or has any of the vulnerable characteristics, including their own use of drugs, alcohol, mental health, even their age, these are protected characteristics of vulnerable victims, that those are the people that would be targeted to try and make them back out of the allegation. Within SCD2, which again has been renamed and reformed as SOECA, this is the arm of specialist crime and operations that would deal with adult sexual offences, so rape, sexual assaults. This really concerns me. The direct quote was, "They are pursuing a strategic investigation to justify the no crime." So effectively what they would appear to be doing, and I read this in the notes, and you can see it, you can read it.
So they're putting resources into trying to downgrade the crime instead of solve the crime?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can physically see this in the notes. Obviously I can't go into the individual reports because that would be inappropriate, but you can physically read that they are actually attacking the allegation of the victim rather than look at anything else first. Now, I do appreciate there are cases where people make it up, and you can see those in the paper. People get sent to prison rightly for it. But you cannot take this as the standard approach to dealing with victims of rape.
I'm going to need to curtail you a little bit because we haven't got unlimited time, and I want to move on to, just very briefly.
One very, very last thing. I note that alarmingly the conversation concluded as follows. What happened in Southwark is still happening. Southwark, the IPCC investigation related to behaviour in 2009. The investigation concluded this year, very early this year, and it's still happening now.
Right, before I come to you, I just want to surface one or two other things from your own evidence, which is that you believe that the skewing of resources was reflected in a new shift system in the Metropolitan Police.
Yes.
Can you just explain that?
Yes. In 2010, the then Assistant Commissioner, he decided that he wanted to install a new shift pattern, predominantly focusing on response teams. In order to do so, they prepared demand profiles, which were based on a number of data factors, but within that, some of the data was based on activity analysis. Activity analysis was a 2-week dip sample, which police officers used to fill in themselves. It was well known to be a nonsense. We used to get told which codes to tick so that it wouldn't affect the budgets and stuff like that. To see that used as the basis for any kind of shift pattern, everybody in policing knows that it's a fallacy. Everybody.
Okay, so we finished up with a new shift pattern.
Yep.
A shift away from the old 12-hour shifts.
Yep.
To a different shift pattern, which you believe resulted in a shortage of resources.
Absolutely.
At the crucial point of the summer riots last year.
The 2011 riots and the Met's initial inability to respond with that was a direct result of the manipulation.
In a couple of sentences, can you just explain what the consequence of the new shift system was that resulted in this shortage of resources on the nights of those riots?
Absolutely. You broke existing teams, which had been working in groups of 4 across 18 of the boroughs, into 15, with varying start times. So there was complete overlap. People couldn't get access to hard resources, radio batteries, cars. People were walking long distance from police stations. They couldn't get onto computer systems because of the crossovers at the shifts. And effectively what it meant was that out of 32,000 police officers, on a Saturday night, which the actual demand profile had identified as a peak time, there was only 3,200 or so police officers on duty. That is not in any way normal.
I find it difficult to get my brain around this, and we may need you to give us a bit more written evidence to surface that, so that we can understand it.
Happy to.
But you're basically saying that the new shift system, which was based on phony data, resulted in a shortage of officers on the night, which meant that the Metropolitan Police weren't in a position to control the riots as they developed on the night.
Absolutely correct.
Would any of the other witnesses like to comment on that? I mean, does that seem like a realistic or reasonable... I mean, it's a shocking allegation. Dr. Patrick.
I unfortunately have the painful experience of being in a position as an inspector in a force control room who had to mobilise the force to deal with a rapidly developing riot. And what my colleague is saying is clear to me, because I had to mobilise the force at 9:30 at night, which was the old 8-hour shift system. I was fortunate that I was able to mobilise the 2:10 shift coming off and create that as a resource to be deployed to deal with the riot. that ability and that speed of response was critical. So if you're having to chase around trying to find little pockets of officers all over the place and bringing them together to one place to then deploy, would make the situation extremely difficult. I mean, I was fortunate in that the timing was that the 210 shift came off, so I mobilised the whole force's 210 shifts. Trying to do it with a system that's just been described would be extremely difficult.
Do either other two witnesses wish to say anything at this? Peter Barron, you're a retired Detective Chief Superintendent of the Metropolitan Police.
Oh, I am, so yes. I can't argue with what James has said. What I would say is that in terms of a more strategic view, is that boroughs are allocated a certain workforce, and that workforce is determined by a number of criteria, some of which is the number of incidents and the number of crimes that are dealt with on those particular boroughs. Exercises have been run where the historical formula to determine those levels of workforce have been shown to be grossly out of kilter with the real demand as opposed to the recorded demand. So there is a massive disconnect between the reality of what is happening on the ground and the formula that is used to determine an appropriate workforce for a borough.
Mr. Ford?
I'd like to echo that, and it's particularly apparent with nighttime economy policing, where there are very few and limited resources that are available. And I'd just like to touch on an issue that just following on from Dr. Patrick earlier. One of the areas that police officers use or are encouraged to use to avoid recording is to actually arrest for offences that don't appear in the National Crime Recording Standards. And one particular offence that causes a great deal of difficulty is around drunk and disorderly offences that do not appear in the crime stats. Now, there are significant numbers of people that are arrested for those offences. It is a particular cause of concern for lots of communities at the moment, but there is a skewing of the figures because ordinarily some people would be arrested in those drunk and disorderly figures for offences under the Public Order Act that aren't actually appearing, so that harm is not being managed, it's not being recognised, and there is some real vulnerability for society there.
Right. You wanted to chip in at this point,
just
Mr. Halfon?
All the things that you've described, and this alleged manipulation of the stats and the way you've set out, who makes the decisions to, when you get told to do these things? Is it done at borough level? Is it done at chief constable level? Is it done just at local control room level? I mean, is there a specific memo that comes down from on high, or how is this done?
If I can explain, in my experience, the vast majority of practitioners, men and women who provide the 24/7 service, and the vast majority of detectives who do the follow-on investigations, turn up at work every day wanting to do a good job, a hard job for the public. They want to serve victims properly. Performance culture then takes its toll in as much as some boroughs have their performance capped. They can only afford to have X number of burglaries per day, X number of robberies per week. The daily meeting, they will discuss individual crimes with a view to seeing what opportunities there are to count them as something other than a priority crime. Within the system, within each force, there is an individual known as the Force Incident Registrar and the Force Crime Registrar. In some smaller forces, they're a combined role. In theory, that individual is the final arbiter as to what is and is not a crime, and if it is a crime, what kind of crime it needs to be classified as. I use the expression in theory because the vast majority are either overruled by ACPO officers or have their activities nullified by having their teams effectively gated and given something else to do, rather than look at areas of performance which would qualify or criticise what some would see as good performance. So they moved away to look at something which isn't important, and when they find something which is damaging to good performance, they're either ignored or marginalised.
But when someone says to you, right, we've got to change this, or we're going to do this way, where does that order come from? And who makes it? How is it decided? How long does it take to be decided?
This has become an ingrained part of the policing culture. Now, in London, the targets would start at MOPAC. The Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. So it would be a 20% reduction over the next 4 years. Right. In that case, that actually arose in error. It was supposed to be a 20% reduction across the 8-year term, but the speechwriter got it wrong, so I'm led to believe. So genuinely, that is the anecdote as to how that target arose. That would then roll down to the chief officers, so the commissioner, the deputy commissioners, deputy assistants, the assistant commissioners, and they would then apply to their business group, how are we going to achieve this 20% reduction? That would then roll down to the commanders, that would then roll down to the superintendents, that would then roll down to the chief inspectors. By the time you get down to the level of inspector to sergeant to PC, that's actually probably become some sort of tightly linked appraisal or part and parcel of the promotion process and assessment. I think if David Gilbertson's written evidence points to this as well, in that actually, because this has been going on for such a long time now, from the 90s right up until today, the entire generation of police leadership, including the junior managers, don't know any other way. So what you're actually talking about is a cultural issue.
But surely it's this stuff written down, these orders that you're given to do the things you're doing. There must be an order written down somewhere which shows that actually we're going to put burglary resources in this area or whatever.
It's a little bit more insidious than that.
I think it's also got something to do with the fact that when targets are set by officers such as the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime, and they are asking for a 20% reduction in crime, what they think they're asking for are 20% fewer victims. That translates to record 20% fewer crimes as far as ACPO and senior officers are concerned. In the latter, the number of victims remains exactly the same. They just don't get recorded, and if they're not recorded as victims, they don't receive any of the victim care that they would do. A, if they were any type of victim, but B, in certain crimes, you receive a prescribed victim care response. If you're a victim of residential burglary or robbery, mugging as it's usually referred to, there is a prescribed response to that. You get a certain type of victim care package. If your windows have suffered chisel marks 4 stories up and it's quite obviously an attempted burglary and it's crimed as criminal damage, you don't receive anything at all. So the levels of victim care, the difference between them is enormous.
Just to clarify one thing before I come to Mr. Flynn. The Home Secretary says she's abolished national police targets. But what does this mean at Metropolitan Police level, for example?
It means absolutely nothing. If you were to look at the corporate scorecard, which is a 3-tier scorecard, Tier 1, Tier 2 and Tier 3, with Tier 1 being the Mayor's target, Tier 2 being the Specialist Crime and Operations and Territorial Policing targets, they are physical documents which have a running total for the year to date.
But who sets these targets?
And a target. They're set by the Mayor's Office, translated at the Metropolitan Police Management Board, and then put into force.
So in fact the target culture is alive and well, despite what the Home Secretary has done?
Very much so, sir, and it's not just isolated to the Metropolitan Police. We have police and crime commissioners demanding reductions in crime, and again it's placing pressure on people in terms of that expectation. And I think it's really important to understand. I don't think, in terms of Mr. Halford's question, that there are memos and diktats from on high in my experience in terms of the organisation I represent, but there is a culture within policing of success, and we have to do this to be successful, and it pervades every level, unfortunately. And I'd like to sort of also make a point in relation to offences that people are actually charged with. There is anecdotal information that people are being charged with lesser offences in order to get those home early and quickly and to move on to the next job, and that's in particular around assault cases.
Moving on, Mr. Flynn.
Can I say that I think we all owe a debt of gratitude to Mr. James Patrick for what he's done on this. Your evidence, I believe, is truly shocking to those who thought we understood a little about this. Could you repeat, just before I start, the anecdote? And I appreciate it is an anecdote, it might not be true, about someone getting, a speechwriter getting his statistics in a twist and the possible consequences.
Absolutely. The reason that this came up in a conversation, I was at an analyst seminar where the performance analysts from the Mayor's office were there. And I was genuinely asking, how did the Mayor's 20% reduction target come across? And the reason I asked that is because they were giggling between themselves, and they said, we all know that by 2015 the only way to achieve these reductions will be by fudging the figures even more. So I said, well, how did this happen? And she said, genuinely, the agreement was that the Mayor saw an 11% reduction in his first term and believed that we could achieve a further reduction of 11% in the second term. When it came to the announcement, instead of it being a 22% reduction across 2 terms, it was a 20% reduction this term. So effectively, the joke was that it was the speechwriter's error.
So the police force is then saddled with an impossible target that's unattainable except by fiddling the figures and going to all the
Absolutely. The word used even by the Mayor's office is fudging. It's no secret.
Okay. So this whole operation that we depend on so much to protect us is at best a fudge, but possibly worse than that. Could we take another? I mean, one can understand the pressure on police officers to attain targets because of what the newspapers say and what the public expect. But there's another imperative here, and that's the link between a performance appraisal and pay and bonuses if the police misrecord crime. Could you explain what the pressure is there? Is it what advantages do police officers have at all stages, up to Chief Constable, have to misrecord crime?
Effectively, there used to be, and I believe it's used to be, someone correct me if it's not changed, cash bonuses for borough commanders and up to chief officers for achieving certain reductions. There used to and then be people's personal targets within their appraisals. Now, obviously, the police works on a pay scale, so you would have to achieve your annual targets in order to be approved for your next move up the pay scale. So that's been embedded for quite a while. They started in the Met a few years ago running this system called TOBAR, which is basically work-based assessment. It's nothing to do with dragging caravans along. And
it's an acronym, is it?
Yeah.
What is it? What is an acronym for?
Temporary Officer Work-Based Assessment, because effectively they temporarily promote you, and then over a period of time they assess you on a number of fixed areas in order to sign you off for your full promotion. And it was designed to replace part 2 of the examination process, and I believe the College of Police are looking at rolling this out as the national model. The problem with this is that it puts people under an immense amount of pressure to meet, I must discipline X amount of officers, I must reduce something, I must improve something, because if I don't, I will not achieve my promotion, I will not achieve the next point on the pay scale. So that's the lower end of it. And that obviously extends all the way through up to the level of inspector. From then on, it's down to competency-based interviews. So you must demonstrate a way that you've reduced crime, that you've improved morale, all these things. So it all comes back to, how do you do that? Well, fundamentally you fudge, because that's the only way that you can do it. But at chief officer level now, we obviously have PCCs. So instead of looking at carrot, which is effectively cash bonus or promotion or advancement, you're now looking at stick. And the stick is, for chief officers, if they don't perform, the PCC can hire or fire them. That's the deal. That's where we are. So no chief police officer is going to want to be on the end of poor performance or missing their target, because it will leave them open to being sacked. Either way you look at it, carrot or stick, both of them are compostable materials. The only difference is that sticks rot slower, so that is something which needs to be monitored.
Providing false information to get yourself a financial advantage is in itself a crime.
Yes.
So we are pushing the police force, the ethos of the police force is one which is encouraging police officers at all levels to commit crimes.
Yes.
Okay. If we take the situation that we have now with this change which you just mentioned, with the Police and Crime Commissioners taken over, and one Police and Crime Commissioner sacked his Chief Constable. His main charge against her was that she was falsifying and giving a too optimistic picture of the crime figures. From your evidence, this sounds as though this is endemic amongst the police forces.
Absolutely.
And that it's... Now, the dilemma placed by the new commissioners is this, that having complained about the previous underreporting of crime and manipulation of figures, if they come down now to alter the system, showing that the true picture is far worse, that will then rebound on them, and people will say police and crime commissioners have actually increased the level of crime. Is that inevitable?
No. The simple caveat to that is they're not increasing the level of crime. The level of crime has never changed.
No, but the perception
is giving an honest view of the level of crime. And I wouldn't... It's not a position that I would envy, but it's not something which is insurmountable. I mean, fundamentally, PCCs are politicians, so they can probably deal with that in a much better way than I could. But it's not fatal, providing that it's done under the flag of honesty and for the people that they're serving, who they've been elected to serve.
And Constable Patrick,
yes.
the pressure that PCCs put Chief Constables and Constabularies under, I mean, it's no different from the pressure that the Home Secretary used to put. I mean, it's the interface of political leadership that we need to address, that the political leadership needs to be mindful that if it's targeting and measuring, it's likely to be distorted.
Yeah. I think Tim Hope's evidence actually points that out quite concisely as well.
Mr. Flynn?
Just the final point. A few years ago, there was a hysterical campaign, one of many hysterical campaigns conducted by the tabloid press on crime. And this particular incident was about knife crime. And there was great excitement, and politicians were under pressure to do something about it. And a member of the Metropolitan Police, with the memorable name of Alfred Hitchcock, came along and gave evidence and said, no, there has been no increase in knife crime whatsoever, from the basis of hospital reports and so on. If what you're saying is right, and what Mr. Alfred Hitchcock was saying was right, decisions were taken. I mean, Parliament moves on the basis of popular perception and prejudice and what pressure they're under. These decisions have been taken on false information.
Yes.
Is that true?
Yeah. I think the worst thing and the saddest realisation for me, I spent the whole of last year defending the police service to a degree from the oncoming reforms and politicisation of the police, because I feel very passionately about public service and how it should be uninterfered with. The saddest thing that I realised was that effectively the police had done it to themselves by spoon-feeding Parliament with misleading figures for over a decade.
I've got a constituent who's a retired member of the Met Force, and he wrote a detailed report. He's a man whose evidence I trust implicitly. And one of the points he made about the Met Force, compared to other forces he worked for, was that there was a brotherhood at the heart of the force, which itself was corrupting. And he put the blame on many of the faults of that force on the existence and the strength of the Freemasons in the Met. Is that a problem you've come across?
I've never had anything to do with masonry.
That's why you're sitting where you are now.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think you've made your point. But I don't wish to pursue Freemasonry. We need to stick to the question of statistics and its consequences. Is there anything else you want to ask at this point?
No, I'm very
Most
happy
grateful to you.
Congratulate.
But I mean, I think what we've heard is basically how there is a system of incentives in the police that has become inherently corrupting. And I think that is a very shocking thing to hear. But before I go on to Mr. Halfon, Mr. Turner, you had something you want to add?
Just to ask, looking at vulnerable people, and particularly young people, it appears that the crimes which have been committed by others they are not protected against these dismissals, if you like, from their treatment. What are the rules about recording vulnerable people's protection?
It's a statutory requirement, I believe.
Yes, well, in terms of the National Crime Recording Standards, if someone makes a complaint on the balance of probability, the police service should record that complaint.
Yes.
So if they make a complaint, they should record it.
And the difference, I think you said 25%?
Yeah, potentially between 21 and 25%.
And you can tell that accurately?
Yeah.
Okay.
The secondary reason that you can tell that that is going to be fairly accurate is because when you look at the statistical norm and you look at the statistical deviation amongst those offence brackets and then use the assessment of the failings in those individual types of crimes to redress that, the crime levels return to the statistical norms. I appreciate that's quite technical and I won't rabble anymore.
Just the point there raised about this balance of probability standard, the National Crime Recording Standard being interpreted as a balance of probability standard. That was not its initial intention. The overriding consideration from the National Crime Recording Standard was victim sovereignty. So when a victim reported a crime, it was taken at face value and recorded. When third parties, a witness reported a crime, then the balance of probability standard should have been applied. Now that became reinterpreted around about 2005 as a result of the National Street Crime Initiative, and the balance of probability standard became applied to all victims, not just witnesses, victims. So in effect we were going back to the old system where a victim had to prove that a crime had occurred and they were a victim of it. Under an evidential crime recording standard or balance of probability standard, the victim becomes a suspect.
That's a very important
It's
point.
a critical
I mean, I have some personal experience of trying to report a crime and having some difficulty to get the police force to record it as a crime, simply because I wanted a pin on the map to show that a crime had been committed. Mr. Turner?
No, nothing further.
Mr. Halfon?
What do you think can be done to solve this problem?
I think there should be a more holistic presentation of issues and information that comes into the presence of the police, and that not just a sole focus on National Crime Recording Standards or the British Crime Survey. There's lots of information in terms of calls for service, how many offenders arrested, how many offenders are brought to justice, and I think if we had a more holistic picture that was readily accessible to the public and to others that could scrutinise and hold their forces and their PCCs to account, that is the way forward. I think the Police UK website is really important. There's a little bit of a time lag in terms of offences being reported, but I think there's an excellent mechanism there for opening up police data and allowing police forces to be held to account for what they deliver upon.
But do you think there should be a independent statistician based in the Chief Constable's office, perhaps from the ONS or another organisation, that would monitor the way statistics are being compiled and look at how police are, obviously you need someone with a police background, or should that come from the Chief Commissioner's offices?
I think it would be helpful to perhaps come from the Commissioner's office, but in terms of anything that increases the trust and the confidence in those statistics, and that those statistics are reliable and police performance and resource allocation, etc., is not skewed on flawed data, because it serves no one's purpose to continue this misleading position that we have with crime statistics.
Can I get views of the other witnesses as well?
You could make a huge improvement very simply by asking the PCCs, first of all, are they aware who their force crime registrar is and when was the last time they had a one-to-one with them? And thirdly, why do they not actually move under the Stage 2 transfer system? Why don't they move the force crime registrars and incident registrars under their wing? The force crime registrars have all of the necessary skills, experience and expertise to do exactly what you're asking for the Police and Crime Commissioner. They had a window of opportunity when they first took office last November to actually decide whether they wanted to be, if you like, part of the problem or part of the solution. The further time moves on, the more they stand a chance of being part of the problem. They have access to all of the knowledge and statistics that they need. If they move the FCR under their wing, they can achieve that very quickly. There also needs to be a removal of perverse performance incentives. very obviously the performance-related pay of ACPO officers to achieve a reduction in crime or an increase in detections, both of which can be easily achieved by playing with figures.
Dr. Patrick?
I think I addressed this issue on my written submission. I perceive the problem is a governance issue. That performance management is a system that confers power and control at the top of the organisation. So it's no good looking at, as you say, for reports that give you an evidential trail so that you can hold somebody to account at a legal level, which they always default to when things go wrong. This is called organisational hypocrisy. So senior officers can escape responsibility. If it's a governance issue, the Chief Constable is accountable to the PCC. At the moment, from what we've heard, both have little incentive to ensure reliable data. But the public rely on accurate data to hold them to account. And I think the Public Affairs Committee said that manipulation of data was a contempt for Parliament, which it is. So the PCCs need to be incentivised to ensure that their chief constables are getting accurate data. At the moment, there's no sanction for them if that's not achieved. It may be a case that Parliament goes back to its older role of ensuring standards, whereby it empowers itself to intervene when a PCC is found to be allowing the manipulation of data and the contempt of Parliament and the public to occur. And
how would the PCC find that out in the first place?
Well, you need a very robust, independent HMIC or Office for National Statistics, or the pair working together to actually check up that the standards are right and things have been done correctly.
But wouldn't that all be reviewing it? I mean, my question was about that you have someone there so it doesn't happen and then you have to investigate it, manipulation, but actually there's someone there all the time in the office of the Chief Constable who has a police background but is charged with ensuring that there is no manipulation of statistics.
I think Peter makes probably the most sensible of all the suggestions, and that is to transfer the performance measurement function completely to the PCC, because the inherent danger of leaving it under the control of the Chief Constable is that this situation, which has been going on for 10, 15 years, will continue. So
what we call the professional standards departments of constabularies shouldn't be in constabularies.
No, that's a wholly separate issue.
Oh, right,
This
okay.
is the performance measurement department, the force crime registrar, the force incident registrar.
But I mean, this is a really savage thing to say, that we can't trust the leadership of our constabularies to measure their own performance. I mean, this is what we pay chief constables to do.
But, and there is a but with this. In 2003, a chief appeared before this committee and he called this exact behaviour administrative corruption. Since then, we've been through the Taylor reforms to discipline. We've had a 10-point code of standards of behaviour. We're on the verge of a new code of ethics, which again is going to be 10 points. And yet, this is happening now. It's just, as Deborah Glass said in her report into Southwark, organisational learning is something which rings hollow. So, unfortunately, it needs something slightly more drastic than to allow somebody to say, well, it didn't happen on my watch. It's happening now. So, separate the functions out. Separate, as I've said in my written evidence, the functions of the standards departments away from the police.
Wouldn't you need both? Because you need someone there in the office of the Chief Constable to change the culture in the first place. So the PCC would be a monitoring thing, but somebody there to liaise with the police commission, whatever they're called now, but authority, but the whole thing is about changing the culture, not...
People respond to incentives. As long as you've got performance-related pay which is attached to reducing crime, recorded crime, or increasing detections, you're always going to find it skewed because people take the path of least resistance. If you then craft a range of performance indicators which are based on quality, so they're qualitative as opposed to quantitative, you'll find the police force is the most can-do organisation imaginable. If you set them a task, they will respond to it positively. Change the performance indicators and it will have an almost immediate response.
Who should change those indicators?
I think that's going to be said by the Home Office.
But aren't the indicators that need to be changed away from financial indicators more to simple principles and values about how you expect police officers to behave?
They are, but there need to be measures which underpin those values.
Why do we need to measure it? Because you know when somebody's being dishonest.
Well, the issues we're describing here, sir, are common knowledge at every level in every force within England and
This
Wales.
is what one might call institutional corruption.
Yes.
You might.
And what happens to people who challenge this culture?
By and large, they're marginalised. If they apply for promotion, they are surprisingly not selected. They're judged to be not a team player. We now find ourselves in a situation where potentially forces will be amalgamating across England and Wales, and therefore chief officers might think it's a good idea to shine bright at this time because they want to be one of the few surviving chief constables. How do they do that? They want to appear good in the eyes of their PCC. How do they do that? They achieve their performance targets.
Mr. Ford, on behalf of the Police Federation, are you dealing with a lot of stifled whistleblowers?
We are, sir, yes. We have lots of anecdotal information, but unfortunately people are fearful of coming forward and raising concerns, and I think that comes down to the whistleblowing aspect of the lack of protection for people, and the peer pressure and the fear factor in terms of their future.
So what do officers think of their leadership in this atmosphere? It can't be very pleasant to work in this atmosphere.
I think there's a serious question from federated members in terms of national leadership in policing. I think that we're on the record of saying that in terms of ACPO as a group of people, but we have real concerns in terms of the leadership culture and the micromanagement that's pervades the service with the performance culture.
Dr. Patrick, have you done any research on attitudes of, levels of engagement and morale in police forces as a result of this culture?
I haven't looked at that directly in terms of that, but the theory would suggest that those that engage in gaming practices will progress through the service right to the most senior positions, and in the past from there on to the inspectorate.
Constable Patrick, do you want to add anything at this point, knowing your personal circumstances and that we don't want to
being a
trespass on that?
Being a whistleblower in the police is just unpleasant. To be honest, I've carried it around for 3 years with me now, and it's not a topic that I particularly want to reveal to the entire world beyond what I've written in here, because it's impacted upon my whole family. I mean, if you just wanted an idea of the reaction to my written submission to this committee, which would be indicative of the sort of the general reaction to police whistleblowing, a assistant chief constable openly on the social media site Twitter tweeted at me in quite an aggressive fashion, basically saying, "Are you calling me a liar, a fool or guilty of misconduct? What you've said is offensive and indefensible." Now, that's a senior identifiable police officer responding to evidence to a parliamentary committee in public to an individual. That's the kind of reaction. If you want the slightly more insidious type of reaction, there is...
But I have to say, it would seem rather unprofessional to me, for a senior officer to be tweeting about a disciplinary matter, whatever his view about it might be.
That, I hasten to add, was in direct response to my written evidence to your committee.
But it didn't name that particular officer.
Oh no, it's under his own name, and
yes,
it was directed
but your
at
evidence
me.
does not name any particular officers.
No, my evidence does not name any particular officer.
So pots and kettles, one imagines.
With your whistleblowing, why did you decide to make it so public? And did you think, I'll go and see my local MP, or go and see the Home Office, or go and see the Police Commissioner about it first? Or maybe you did all these things, but can you just set and train why you decided to do what you did?
Over the last 3 years, I've been through my line management, my borough management, up to the level of the assistant commissioners. You can't go to the IPCC because of Section 29 of the Police Reform Act, even though under Section 37 of the Police Reform Act, they're the prescribed regulator under the whistleblowing legislation. Double bind, can't do it.
That's one of the things you recommend that we change.
Absolutely. It's a really, really simplistic measure.
Because you submitted a complaint for your senior officers to give to the IPCC,
Yeah.
and they refused to give it.
Absolutely. I was given the opportunity by my counsel, my legal counsel, to give fundamentally what would have been this evidence to the Home Affairs Select Committee in January this year. I was expressly declined permission by the Chief Officer of the Directorate of Professional Standards to speak to a parliamentary committee.
What about your MP? Did you approach your MP first?
I approached... I was reluctant to for a long time because, frankly, my understanding of what benefit there could possibly be from doing that, apart from potentially a letter...
Yeah, but your MP... I'm not criticising what you've done, I'm just trying to understand it.
Yeah.
So, your MP could have probably taken up your case and then gone to see all the people that you may not have been able to see.
But
And
I did...
including... did you say you're not allowed to see the Chief Police Commissioner for the area, or you are?
Tell you what, if you could get an appointment...
But your MP could have done that with you. I'm just trying to understand the process that led you
at the
to
appropriate point...
doing the thing. Yeah, you did.
At the appropriate point, I wrote to my MP as a constituent, and he responded, and it was dealt with at the appropriate time.
Yeah.
Mr. Hopkins.
Yes, well, quite frankly, what I've heard this morning is astonishing, and I'm sure most members of the public would find that too. I'm almost open-mouthed, with unable to find words to say what I think. But you know, clearly the public confidence in police statistics must be now, as a result of today, must be rocketing down to zero or plummeting to zero, and that. You say in every police force this is going on to try to manipulate and massage statistics to present an apparent reduction in crime. So you know, the confidence that we can take for granted, the confidence of the public, and one hope that the policymakers will now take note of what you've said this morning, and certainly I hope our report will press them in that direction. What is the impact on victims of crimes if their crimes are being misrecorded? I mean, that's a serious concern to me. Victims.
Victims are missing out in a huge way. Many people are persuaded that, you know, their pocket hasn't been picked. You know, is it possible that you've lost it, to the extent whereby, you know, from experience, victims have been rung of robbery, street robbery, where violence has been used to take the property from them. They've been rung back on so many occasions to try and persuade them that in fact they were mistaken and no violence was used and it was merely just slipped from their bag, that victims were putting the phone down in disgust, purely harassed by another call from somebody else trying to persuade them that they were mistaken about the level of force used. And we're talking about professional, perfectly sound thinking individuals who've been the victims of crime. If you do become a victim of crime, becoming a victim of priority crime is even more difficult, because of course forces will argue, boroughs will argue at a lower level, we can only afford to have 6 robberies a day to stay within our weekly target, so many to stay within our monthly target. If we get that, great, I'll get promoted, everybody's happy. If we don't, I'm going to give everybody a hard time. So,
I highlighted this issue in relation to incidents involving domestic violence and child protection, child abuse, where the incidents weren't recorded and investigated, and subsequently this led to homicide. So that is the extreme end of the risk that people are taking. It isn't just about fudging the figures just to keep everybody happy. There are really serious consequences of this behaviour.
I think that there's a re-victimisation of the original victim in terms of their lack of trust and confidence in an organisation and a service that should be there to protect people. And the ultimate sanction, really, or the consequence, sorry, is that offender goes on to commit further offences and there's further victims. So people are being let down on a massive scale.
Yes.
Constable Patrick.
As police officers, we have a statutory obligation under the Victims Code of Practice for the way that we deal with victims of crime. We're clearly not meeting that. If you could imagine being a victim of rape, which is an absolutely abominable offence, and those that are charged with actually protecting you and providing you with support and investigating what's just happened to you are in fact pressurising you into retracting your allegation, it's absolutely disgusting. And beyond that individual human aspect of it, which is completely abhorrent, there are broader impacts still which go to crime pattern analysis being ineffective, which means that suspects are left to carry on offending for months, for years. It's just the entire thing. It's revolting.
There is legislation, Corporate Manslaughter and Homicide Act 2007, which looks at, as opposed to the old health and safety legislation, which basically looked at the person who should have perhaps shut the bow doors on the ferry or whatever. In the old legislation, they were the only people who could be potentially culpable. Legislation was changed in this new legislation. Corporate Manslaughter and Homicide Act 2007 was brought in to look at those responsible for setting out the policies and procedures responsible for ensuring good governance within an organisation. My suspicion is that that legislation will actually be brought to bear on those senior officers who have been aware of the situation for a long time, have done nothing about it. The files are full of audits by the Audit Commission, HMIC, NPIA, and internal audits from their force crime registrars, which by and large say exactly the same thing, and they rehearse the issues we've been describing today. To say they were unaware is farcical, but when officers are not in a position to use that information to conduct an accurate and effective risk assessment, and as a result somebody is killed or seriously injured, I think somebody should be held responsible for it.
Mr. Hopkins?
I mean, it strikes me that that performance-related pay is wholly inappropriate inside a professional service like the police service, particularly the police service. Over 20 years ago, private industry abandoned performance-related pay because it had a demoralising effect, and actually productivity went down, not up. To now be fined 20 years later in a professional service, which is still being used and with devastating effects, I think is appalling. But if we just took one police force and tried a different approach, went back to the idea of a professional service with no performance-related pay, with a strong code of ethics, a code of practice about and making sure that every crime was reported, every crime was pursued, just to do a comparison between one force and another, would we find some very different? Would we see some amazing comparisons?
Enormous.
Yeah.
Mr. Mulholland.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I think I would certainly share my colleagues' view that I think we've been amazed and appalled at what we've heard today, and I think some of the things you've said have really blown the lid off the what appears to be endemic manipulation of crime figures, which is something that is not only a concern clearly to this committee but to everyone else. Now, there seems to me to be two different elements to this, and this is something as a committee that we're both looking at, and one is, and this was a word one of you used, institutionalised corruption that's going on in terms of the manipulation of figures in the way that's been described. The other, of course, and this is where there's a direct responsibility of Parliament and of government, is where political pressure is inadvertently causing the sort of behaviours that we are talking about. But as people who have all had experience in different ways, very simply, what are we going to do? What needs to change both in the political leadership and structures of policing, but also in terms of stamping out the abuse of culture, so that this sort of thing stops happening and people can actually have confidence in the figures that we're being told are the figures for crime in this country?
I was just to say, we need a broader approach in terms of what's reported to the public, and as I've already said, we shouldn't just focus on national crime recording figures. There's so much that policing manages in terms of risk, in terms of what we deliver for the public, and the vast majority of police officers do a fantastic job day in, day out, but that work isn't recognised, it isn't understood. So I think if we had that broader, holistic perspective in terms of what's measured, what we do, that would be the starting point. But leadership is key here. I know the HMIC is going to be undertaking some work in the new year around inspection regimes in forces. We have the Code of Ethics that's potentially a way forward that's been announced by the Home Secretary, and we also have the authorised professional practice from the College of Policing. So key is leadership, culture, and change to systems and processes with a focus on people, not stats. And that's where I think we lose a lot of our way as a service, is that we see people as just abstract figures rather than human beings that have been touched by criminality and have had their lives changed by that.
And if we just press you on the second point, you know, we're all politicians. How does this have to change politically? How does the approach to this have to change politically to stop this happening? It
would help if politicians and others stopped using crime stats as the be-all and end-all, as a total success of policing and of public safety. It's very misleading, it's inaccurate, and it helps no one with the continued focus on crimes down. You'll see people crowing about, you know, crimes down this week. They don't mention the previous 2 weeks of crimes gone up. So, and you know, we'll have some bad weather, the crime's down, but next week the weather's fine and it goes up again. There is just such a manipulation and misuse of crime stats that helps no one.
Just
Ms. Hopkins, briefly.
Very simply, I mean, 10 years ago, my local divisional commander said, sorry, but we're going to see burglary go up. And I said, why is that? He said, because 3 of our burglars are living in a particular state have been released from prison. Yeah. Very simply, and that's the truth. I mean, I want to hear that sort of thing. That's realistic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we've reached the end of this session. I'm extremely grateful to you for being so frank and honest and courageous. Don't we want a police service that is actually driven by the highest values of integrity, truthfulness, decency, fairness, rather than one driven by targets? And how can we bring that about? Can you think of an example of an English or Welsh constabulary that would fit that criteria?
During my research, I came across Greater Manchester, where the chair of the police authority and his clerk were very much on to trying to maintain standards. And they were aware of what the National Crime Recording Standard was, and they went into police stations to look at these signs that were up, saying, question people about making false reports, and took them down. The problem was that the Crime Recording Standard changed its interpretation to this balance of probability, and their ability to audit that was severely limited, is restricted because of it, because it's so loose. So you need to look at that again and go back to the victim sovereignty. So that when somebody reports a crime, it's their right to have it recorded, investigated. If it's found to be false later on, then they can be charged with the offences. It won't affect the crime figures because there'll be another offence recorded. One will come off the books and one will go on. So the burglary will come off and the fraud will go on.
But don't we want a police force, which, whatever the incentives are, where the police say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that, that's not right, or this is going on and I'm going to report it, and the leadership say, thank you for reporting this, it's not right.
Why do we change of emphasis, sir, in as much as instead of seeing an increase in crime as being a negative thing whereby people are going to be beaten up for it, metaphorically, it needs to be seen as enriching the intelligence picture. We're now having a better understanding of what is happening and where it's happening and when it's happening. But at the moment, that is missed completely. That is completely undervalued.
I personally no doubt that political leadership has played a big part in the decline of policing standards and standards of behaviour in the police that you've described. And personally, I would like to apologise on behalf of politicians of all parties who are responsible for creating this atmosphere in which targets must be achieved, creating the perverse incentives that have created this situation. And this must be addressed by the political class as well as the police. But I ask my question again, what kind of leadership should we be looking for in the police service at the top of our constabularies that will root out this practice, whatever the incentives set by politicians? And we're not universally reliable, we politicians, let's face it.
Good governance and independent regulation. Mm-hmm. Regulators with the power to inspect and bring this sort of evidence to the attention of appropriate authorities to act, and a courage to act when malpractice is uncovered. That has been lacking over the years. Certainly what we've disclosed to you here today has been disclosed and has been uncovered, but no one's acted.
I think that is the most shocking thing of all, is that this is part of a long ongoing discussion over many years, and the fundamental problem has not been addressed.
Can I add to that, sir?
Mr. Barron.
There also needs to be a whistleblowing facility which is demonstrably independent of the organisation, in this case the police service. In a previous incarnation, I was head of operations for the Internal Investigations Command, and various allegations came through there which related to these very issues. So this is nothing new. But
the repeal of Section 29 of the Police Reform Act would address that. It would mean that whistleblowers like Mr. Patrick would be able to go straight to the IPCC, which they can't at the moment.
Yeah.
Mr. Patrick?
Again, as I write in my evidence, I would further say that the actual responsibility for the investigation of the police should be removed from the police completely. The IPCC have been fighting for more responsibility and more budget. Give it to them. That would be the most sensible thing.
And do you think there's a case for an organisation like the Committee on Standards in Public Life to investigate values and policing in the United Kingdom?
I think there's certainly room for an inquiry as the bare bones of starting that, yes.
You're all nodding.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed for your evidence today. And we will now move on to the second panel. I do apologise, we're running a bit late. Thank you.
Crime, sort of continuous offence rule. You could also massage the figures by de-recording crimes, decategorising them. So a senior officer would look at a crime report and decide that no crime had occurred and inappropriately take it off the books. Then you've got other methods whereby you downgrade burglaries to theft from property, attempt burglaries as criminal damage.
And that's all under the term cuffing?
Yes.
And what about nodding?
Nodding is another matter altogether. That's about collusion between offenders and police officers to improve the detection rate, where a deal is reached with the offender for them to omit a number of offences, thus making the performance of the force look good in terms of detections, in return for inducements either through charging less serious offences and TIC-ing more serious ones so that the sentence is reduced, or an agreement to produce the offender from prison after they've been sentenced and take them in a nodding exercise where they drive round and nod at properties that they are supposedly have broken into. And that improves the detection rate. And sometimes inducements in the forms of sex, alcohol, access to meals, etc. is offered on those occasions when they're brought out of prison. That's nodding.
And what is skewing?
Skewing is putting your resources into the areas that you've been measured in. So if your performance measures are to reduce burglary, you put your resources into investigating burglaries at the cost of investigating something like rape or child protection, and you move your resources accordingly. Sometimes you will see forces systematically move resources out of inner city areas to more affluent areas where crime is easier to detect. Generally that's not done deliberately, but the way that the formulas are used can result in that occurring. It's quite a complex issue, that movement of resources.
And finally, stitching?
That's the old phrase for fitting somebody up, putting evidence into their mouths, either through verbally attributing false confessions to them. Those tended to be practices that were prevalent in the past, less so now. It tends to be abuse of non-judicial disposals, which lends itself to sort of stitching where somebody's offered a caution when really there isn't evidence that would result in a conviction, or informal warnings. Sometimes the suspect isn't even aware that they've occurred. So they're recorded as responsible for a crime without them actually being confronted about it.
Now, Constable Patrick, could you first of all describe to us what your various roles have been in the Metropolitan Police to do with the recording and measurement of crime?
Absolutely. I transferred to the Metropolitan Police in October 2009. On my transfer, I had a background in intelligence analysis, which I'd been doing at my previous
I think you have to
force.
speak up a little bit.
Sorry, I'd been doing intelligence analysis at my previous force. So I had a good concept of the measurement of crime, how to analyse it correctly, the different types and brackets of crime, and some of the tricks which Roger has described. I came initially to a response team. My experience on that response team essentially was to do with robberies, first of all, in that robbery offences, and I do mean clear robbery offences, would be downgraded. In the Met, they use to do so an offence called theft snatch, which doesn't actually exist. It isn't recognised by the Home Office. It's a convenient way of effectively getting a robbery off the books, but not putting it into the theft from person bracket. It was a non-existent type of crime, and this would happen even in clear cases where there was CCTV showing a robbery taking place. The extent of this on the borough that I was initially on was large. They were showing on some reports, which were very swiftly removed, a 400% increase in street robberies. If you were to look at the same reports a couple of days later, robberies would be static, but theft snatch would have increased by a large amount. I challenged this on my borough. I eventually contacted the Assistant Commissioner proposing an alternative way of doing this, and was given a specialist role at Territorial Policing Headquarters, where I went on to look at some new types of measures that would help us step away from this categoric measurement or targeting of these types of crime like robbery. From there, I was involved in a project which was working with the Home Office to review the way that burglary is investigated in the Met. Again, burglary
Order. Welcome to this first evidence session on crime and statistics. I'd like to welcome each of our witnesses and invite each of you to identify yourselves for the record, please.
James Patrick, police officer.
Paul Ford from the Police Federation of England and Wales.
Roger Patrick, retired police officer.
Peter Barron, retired police officer.
I just have sort of one or two parish notices. First of all, I think I should declare the fact that James Patrick is a serving police constable with the Metropolitan Police, but who lives in my constituency. And this evidence session arises out of the accident that Mr. Patrick is my constituent. And he came to see me about his disciplinary case and the situation he's found himself in. I make no comment about that in this forum, and nor should his disciplinary hearing be referred to in this evidence session, as we're going to treat that as what we call sub judice. That is not for discussion. But I just feel I ought to say that Mr. Patrick is my constituent, which is how he came to be here. And secondly, I think it's only fair to say that Dr. Roger Patrick and Constable James Patrick are not related. and there is no connection between them, even by marriage. Third, I want to put on record how grateful I am for the written evidence we have received, and how personally I am truly shocked by what I have read. Shocked for two reasons. Shocked that apparently such manipulation of police statistics could possibly happen on such a wide scale and become so institutionally prevalent. And shocked that we have known about it for such a long time and so little has changed as a result of that public knowledge of this problem. Finally, I just wish to say another point about privilege. Whatever you say in this session is privileged. That is, so long as you believe it
is an area where crimes are downgraded or moved into other brackets, such as criminal damage for attempted burglary or other types of thefts. I found, doing the pre-analysis on one borough for this, that there was a disparity of several percent, and that depended on which of the two force systems you used to retrieve the data from.
So you were looking at two systems of data, recording data, and they were basically recording the same data.
Absolutely. They were recording the same data, but both systems would show a variation in the level of the same offences. So it was completely inexplicable. I discussed this with some of the analysts at the Met, and they highlighted to me that they'd been aware of this problem for some time, and they'd actually performed some audit reports and found that as many as 300 burglaries would disappear within a couple of week period. So things would clearly be being reported as burglaries. You then rerun the same report. There'd been a human intervention, i.e. a management intervention, and those burglaries had effectively disappeared in a puff of smoke. I then was put into another specialist role, this time with serious crime and operations, and working on the crime fighters team, which effectively once a month gathers together the headline performance data for specialist crime and operations at a very senior level. So you're talking an assistant commissioner, chief superintendents and commanders sat in the room to discuss what's happened in that month. As part and parcel of that, in July, I did some analysis around serious sexual offences and rape. In the course of doing that, I found that no crimes, which is a way effectively of establishing that a report is no longer a crime to be investigated, were incorrect in about 80% of cases.
80%?
Yes. That's my professional opinion based on what I looked at. It was 80% of cases. I went on to look at crime-related incidents, which is another very Met-centric type of thing. It's where effectively you say, yeah, crime has occurred, but it's a third-party report. That would be the general rule for when you would use a crime-related incident instead of a crime. So the victim hasn't confirmed it to you face-to-face. It's a referral from another agency. In reviewing those, I found that in 70% of cases, they shouldn't have been crime-related incidents. They were clear crimes. So I went on to do some analysis.
To be true, and sincerely believe it to be true, you can say whatever you like without fear nor favour, because no court or disciplinary hearing or other tribunal can use in evidence against you anything you say in this committee. But that is obviously a privilege not to be abused. But that means we also cannot refer to, as I said, the disciplinary hearing in question, or indeed to the case of 5 officers in a certain constabulary who are subject to proceedings regarding their alleged manipulation of data. You may be aware of the case in question. I have one other formality, which is to welcome Sheila Gilmore to this committee, newly elected. Very much enjoying you being here and having joined the committee. Thank you very much for your interest. I have to ask whether you have any interests to declare.
Only the ones that are on my register of interests.
That's fine. So there are no other particular interests relevant to this committee that you feel you're required to declare?
No.
Thank you. We will now proceed. May I ask each of you to give a view on, well, perhaps I could start with Dr. Patrick. Can you just describe what techniques, which you've described in your written evidence, tend to be used by police officers to alter the outcome of the statistical measures that we use for recording crime?
Certainly, sir. There's a number of techniques that come under what police officers would call the generic term of cuffing. That's making crime figures disappear up the sleeve in reference to the magician's art. The actual methods would be someone reports a crime to disbelieve them and not record it at all. Say they're making it up or it's a false report. Secondly, they may well record it as lost property. Another technique would be to record a sequence of crimes in the same street, say 5 or 6 cars that have been broken into, different owners, record that as just one